Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grace Every Day, a podcast for Christian wives of blue-collar guys to help you get healthier and happier. And today's podcast episode is just a little bit different. You'll notice I'm using a different background. I'm going to use kind of a different format as well because I wanted to go over a few pieces of content in the form of slides. And if you've ever seen me speak or you've seen me and Mac speak together, you'll know that first off, we very, very, very rarely use slides when we're speaking live or in front of an audience because it's much more dynamic to actually just be speaking and interacting with the audience. And a PowerPoint generally tends to put people, just in a different zone. You've heard of death by PowerPoint, I've probably, but it's one of the things that they say in the speaking world is that when you're using PowerPoint slides, it's really much harder to connect with the audience. And a lot of times I see speakers who do use a PowerPoint and they end up just reading the slides to the audience, and the audience has already read them for themselves, and it tends to be a much less effective presentation. And so if you've ever seen Mac and I speak, we don't usually use PowerPoint slides or slides. We typically just speak and really enjoy that authentic connection to the audience. But all that being said, there are times when I find for a presentation or topic such as this, where sometimes it does help to have that visual reference. And so I wanted to do today's podcast on really some of those critical conversation skills for what I call difficult dialogue. Because I know many of us, whether it's at home with our kids or our husbands, or whether it's at work, or maybe you're the leader of a nonprofit and you're leading a team, or you're interacting with the community or volunteers, or regardless of what your role is, all of us have a need at specific times for those crucial skills, those critical skills for high stakes conversations. And for me, this is one of the things that really helped me be more effective in my communication, recognizing when I needed to use those critical skills that, I didn't learn early on because, I'd never been taught. And I think I mentioned before on a couple of podcast episodes back that it's interesting to me how, in all of my college classes and courses, I had a lot of classes on communication, but not a lot of classes. I didn't have any classes on the ability to actually connect with people. And all of those quote unquote communication classes were on things like speaking and presenting, and public speaking was one of them. Writing, English 101, typewriting. Well, today we'd call it keyboarding. But I never had a class on actually listening, right? And we'll kind of get into that in just a few minutes because listening is one of those critical skills we are going to talk about today. But all that being said, you'll notice that today's background is a little different. Today's format is a little different, and I'm actually going to be using some slides for sort of a visual reference. And today's podcast episode is all about difficult dialogue, critical conversation skills for high stress situations. So let's just jump right in. This is actually a couple of the chapters in my book, Straight Talk, The Power of Effective Communication, are dedicated to this whole topic. So if this interests you or you want to learn more, you want a deeper dive, you can pick up a copy of the book. Of course, it's on the website or it's on Amazon. You can also download several chapters of this book for free. Don't have to put in a credit card. Don't have to put in an email. You guys know by now that's not how I roll. You can just go to riastory.com/download, and you can download a PDF, a sample chapter from this book. I don't think it's the chapters specifically dealing with difficult dialogue that we're going to talk about today, but it does give you some sample chapters from the book if you want to take a deeper look. So jumping right in, a couple of things that I wanted to cover today. Number one, what makes a conversation critical to begin with? What decides if this is a critical conversation? So much of the time throughout our day, we are just engaging in small talk or conversations that just don't have a lot of depth to them. And that's not a bad thing. We certainly don't have the emotional energy for every conversation throughout our day to be a critical, high stakes conversation, right? And most of our interactions, particularly like at home or at work with those people we work with a lot, we don't need to get into a high stakes, really critical, intense situation. A lot of times we are conveying information or just interacting with someone, and that's more of a surface conversation instead of a deep heart to heart, heartfelt conversation. So we're going to talk about that, how to know when those conversations are headed that direction. And we're going to talk about some proactive responses and outcomes, and then some skills to actually apply. If you've been following my conversation or if you've been following my podcast for very long, you know that I love actual information, not just theory. So drilling down into that, what makes those conversations critical to begin with? These are the things that I talk about in the book that really create the definition for difficult dialogue. Those conversations that are hard to have. Maybe they're conversations that you don't want to have, especially if you are a person that doesn't like conflict, or you don't like the challenge of difficult conversations or difficult dialogues. Or maybe you're just a non-confrontational personality, and so you don't necessarily like these conversations that are difficult. And they can be challenging, right? There's no doubt that they can be challenging. So 3 things about that. Anytime there's a different perspective or opinion, and it's got to be a high risk or high level of emotional involvement. So for example, if you're asking your hubby, hey, what do you want for dinner tomorrow night? And he's like, I want tacos. And you're like, well, I wanted pizza. Probably for most of us, that is not a high level of emotional involvement. You could probably go, oh, I could go with tacos and, we'll have pizza next week, right? Probably not a critical decision point in your marriage as to whether you have tacos or pizza. Might be different perspectives, but you have to also have that high level of emotional involvement. It has to mean something. It has to mean a lot to both parties or all parties involved. Or again, it's just a difference of opinion and somebody is willing to compromise or say, hey, we can have dinner wherever you want. And strong feelings, right? Again, if you're not heavily emotionally invested in that, then that's not probably a difficult dialogue situation. Now, we do encounter these difficult dialogue situations all throughout our day. But most of the time, it may only have like one of these 3 elements present and not necessarily all of them. And so again, that's just a little more of a surface conversation than a deep, heart-to-heart conversation. I love Stephen Covey's quote here: 90% of all communication problems are caused by differences, either in semantics or perceptions. I remember I was at a conference, and kind of one of the exercises that they did, they gave probably everyone in the audience, maybe not everyone in the audience, but a lot of people in the audience got these just blow up beach balls. And, it was maybe basketball size when you blew it up. But the cool thing about it was each of the sides, it's a round ball, obviously, but there were 6 or 7 pieces, that made up this whole ball. And each one of them was a different color. And I kind of liked that because it just reminded us that you might be seeing a different color and I'm seeing a different color because we're on different sides of the beach ball, but we're looking at the same ball, right? And a lot of times, or most of the time, when we get into a conflict with someone or a difficult dialogue situation, we are looking at the same beach ball, but we have a different perspective. We have a different perception. We have a difference in semantics. This happens with me and Mac all the time. Is he'll say something and I'll say something, but I say it back to him in my words with my perspective, and he says, well, that's not what I said. Or he'll say, oh, well, that's what I just said. I just said it differently. And I go, well, yeah, of course, that's what you just said. I just restated it, right? My point here being that we see the world as we are, And that's going to color how we see a situation. And that causes a vast majority of our conflicts, our interpersonal conflicts, perhaps even more at home with husbands and children, because there's a lot more emotional energy invested where our heart is, where our home is. And so a lot of times we just have to make sure that we are aware that we are looking at the same issue, but we see it as we are. We see it through our lens, our frame of reference. I like to use the analogy that we're all looking through at the world through a set of glasses. And just like your eyeglass prescription or your contact prescription might be different because of, you're a different person, your figurative glasses of how you see the world and the lens that which you see the world is different as well. If you've come from a difficult childhood, for example, and your parents always fought, or you always just saw so much conflict at home, that's going to change how you see, or potentially change how you see conflict situations as an adult. It might be a trigger for you, right? Because you don't feel safe because of that history, that past experience. There's nothing wrong with that. We all see the world a little bit differently, but my point is sometimes you're going to see it differently than someone else, and just recognize that your perception is not necessarily reality, but it's your reality until you remember to step away and look at the beach ball from a different side. So how do we diffuse it? Couple of things to be aware of here. Number one, the conditions are important when the content is important. Now, if you are walking into a situation and it's going to be a difficult dialogue situation, then put some thought into the conditions when and where you have that conversation. Many years ago, I was in a situation at the job where I was, so this was quite a few years ago, and we had a type of bonus structure there. And I won't get into all of the details of the situation, but basically the end of the month came and I got my bonus check, and it wasn't as much as I thought it should be. And so I knew this was going to be a difficult dialogue situation, right? When I'm approaching my boss and going, hey, I don't think you gave me enough money for this bonus. So I had to be intentional about when and where to have that conversation, right? Don't just confront them the moment they walk in the door at work, but be intentional about, hey, do you have some time later this afternoon where we can sit down and have a conversation, right? Give them some time to prepare. This could also look a lot of different ways if you're at home or with your kids or something like that, or maybe you need to have a difficult conversation with your husband. And so there again, be intentional about the conditions where that conversation takes place if you can. Of course, you're not always going to be able to pick the time and place for a difficult dialogue situation, but just remember the conditions are important when the content is important. Number two, make sure that you are noticing when other people feel threatened, and you kind of know it. You'll see body language, you'll see facial expressions change. A lot of times tone of voice is the first thing that changes when someone is feeling threatened. And then number three, notice when you're feeling threatened. And that could be your own body language or your own tone of voice. Sometimes we talk in a higher octave. Sometimes we just get louder. That's one of the first signs that someone is feeling threatened, is they start getting louder and louder and louder in the conversation. Now, the reason they get louder, or we get louder, is because subconsciously we don't feel like the other person understands us. And so again, subconscious, we're not really aware of it, but sometimes we know the other person doesn't understand our perspective, so we get louder in the effort to communicate better, which does not make sense. But again, a lot of times this is just happening at that subconscious level, right? That sometimes the conditions are present when we start feeling threatened. We get into that fight or flight mode, and so that triggers just that feeling. If I just talk louder, they'll understand me better, right? It doesn't work like that. But again, a lot of times this is happening at a subconscious level, or it's happening very quickly, and your conscious mind gets shoved out of the way, and your feelings tend to take over if you're not very careful. So look for those early signs when someone or you are feeling threatened. Lawrence Peter says, speak when you're angry, and you will make the best speech that you will ever regret. And I can't tell you how true this is. I know I'm not the only one who said or done something in the emotion of the moment and later thought, oh, I should not have said that. So it's important not to speak from a place of anger or high emotion, because we often do say things that we don't mean, or things that we regret later. So making sure that we are aware of when that's happening. Now, the reason this is important, and this brings us to our next slide, is we all have a particular style, whether it's in our communication, our interactions with others, but we all have a slightly different style when we are stressed out. And you got to know this about yourself and about your spouse or your boss or your coworker. What is my style? And what is my style under stress? What is their style? And what is their style under stress? So, for example, my style under stress is to withdraw. I could use the analogy of a turtle shell. Like, when I am feeling, the more stressed I'm feeling, the more I tend to just withdraw. It might mean physically leaving the room, or it might mean just avoiding the conversation or avoiding the issue altogether. I don't tend to be very verbal at all. I just tend to withdraw into silence. But verbal games or even sarcasm could be a red flag that you're shifting into that stressful mode of communication. So I do tend to withdraw. Like, anytime there is a conflict or any situation where there's conflict, I just want to crawl into my turtle shell naturally, right? Now, the reason that's important for me to know is that when I feel that stress level rising or those emotions kind of coming up, I have to be very intentional not to just withdraw, right? Not to just crawl into that turtle shell, because nothing gets resolved in the turtle shell, right? Cannot be effective at resolving the issue if I'm avoiding the issue. Now, Mac tends to be a little more verbal, particularly under stress. And so his style under stress is he does want to talk things out. He does want to just, let's sit down and address it. Now, I can't speak to where he goes in times of extreme stress. That would be something that he could speak more to. But my point here is just know where you are, and then know where you go in terms of stress, because you might be that person that's naturally withdrawn, but in times of stress, you move more into verbally aggressiveness or verbal, not attacking. I hate to use that word, but sometimes that could be a sign of someone who's under a lot of stress. Now, the reason that this is important, there was a book called Super Communicators that I really enjoyed. I think I read it last year. And I love what they had to say about high energy. And a lot of times, again, subconsciously, if someone has a lot of high energy, that can feel threatening to someone whose energy is lower. Now, it may not mean that they intend to threaten them literally, but it means subconsciously, when we don't feel safe, if someone is, high energy and they are very, just aggressive physically, and I don't mean physically whopping you over the head, I mean like body language. They talk with their hands a lot. They use words and get louder, right? That's what I mean when I say they're verbally more aggressive. Or conservative, right, would be the other end of the spectrum, just quieter, withdrawn, just listening. But when someone is verbally more excited and they have higher energy, if your energy level is low and theirs is high, you might feel threatened, and vice versa, right? So again, just being aware of who we are naturally, where do we turn to in times of stress, and how does that impact our interactions with others, particularly important interactions, right? I think it's very interesting or just very important to be aware of maybe you've had a bad day or a stressful day or an exhausting day or your energy is low for whatever reason. and it's the end of the day, you're tired, you're stressed, you're cranky, you're hungry, I don't know. Any of those conditions, though, that's not a great time to have a difficult dialogue. If you can avoid it, it's better to say, you know what? This is an important issue. It deserves my best self, and I'm not showing up as my best self in this moment. So let's talk about this tomorrow, or let's talk about this on the weekend when we have time, right? Again, you're not always going to be able to control those conditions of when these difficult dialogue situations occur. But every time you have that ability to say, I'm feeling really tired today. Can we talk about this tomorrow? If it's okay, right? And if it's not okay, then you may have to just dig right in. But be aware that particularly when you are in a stressful frame of mind or tired, exhausted, you really have to be more careful and more intentional so that your emotions don't take over. And that's going to bring us to some skills. Mac and I talk about over and over and over again. If you've ever heard us speak, we talk about press pause. Stephen Covey talks about, as human beings, we have the ability to pause when something happens and choose our response. This is so, so powerful, particularly in high stakes, difficult dialogue situations. Pause. Don't just reply automatically. Don't just speak out of the emotion. When you hear something, I want you to stop and just think about what you truly value in this situation. What is the outcome that I want from this conversation? And you want to choose your response to whatever the other person has said based on values. How can both of us win? What's the great outcome for both of us out of this situation? Again, if you're talking pizza and tacos, that's not really a high stakes, difficult dialogue situation most of the time. But when it comes down to critical conversations, relocating, a new job, whether to have another baby, right? Those could be potentially difficult dialogue situations. And in those moments, anytime those conversations are coming up, pause before you respond. Hit the pause button. And I love to think about it just like this picture, a big red pause button. If you've ever seen that old Staples commercial that had an easy button, I just love that image of a pause button, big red pause button that just says, pause. Before I respond, let me take a step back. What do I want out of this conversation? What do I really want? And I have to want us both to win more than I want to be right. And that's what we all truly want. But again, a lot of times when we're in those situations where emotions are high, differences of opinions are great. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot of emotional energy invested. It's harder to speak from a place of what I truly value and being proactive. And it's much easier to speak quickly and reply from a place of high emotion of the moment. I love Northcote Parkinson's quote here. He says, "The void created by the failure to communicate is soon filled with poison, drivel, and misrepresentation." And that's just a great reminder that sometimes we have avoided putting off those conversations, but the void there of the failure to communicate is usually filled with something bad. And so when you know that you need to have one of these difficult dialogue situations, go on and have it. Don't put it off. Make sure that you are not leaving that void there. Because if we are, the void almost always gets filled with something bad, and that's something that hurts the relationship long term. It could be resentment on your part. It could be resentment on the other person's part. It could be anger. It could be that misunderstanding just grows. Anytime we're leaving that void by not having a conversation we should have, we are opening up the possibility for the other person to tell themselves the wrong story. And it is important not to tell ourselves the story, right? But our brains are really good at telling stories. If you've ever think back when you were a child and you did those connect the dot exercises, where you would, you start from one point and you would draw to number one, and then you draw to number two, and you draw to number three, and you would just connect the dots. And at the end of it, you'd have a picture of something. Well, pretty soon, if you did those enough, you got really good at just looking at the dots and going, oh, it's a heart shape, or it's a star shape, or whatever, right? You didn't even have to actually physically draw the outline. You could just look at the shapes. Well, our brain kind of does the same thing. Our brains are good at taking a couple pieces of information and then filling in the rest. The problem is that a lot of times it fills in the rest with something other than fact. So we really have to be careful that we are focusing on the facts of a situation. And that brings us to this slide. Anytime we're in a difficult dialogue situation, it's important to focus on, first and foremost, what really happened. And next, what are the facts of the situation? So important when we talk about situations at work, dealing with customers or team members, but so much more important when we're talking about home relationships and conversations, where, again, anytime there's more emotion invested in the situation, it's much easier for us to jump to conclusions, tell ourselves stories, and sometimes our brain comes up with the wrong story. So focusing on the facts, what actually happened, and take the emotion out of it, right? Be objective when you focus on the facts, and that allows you to be more objective when you're talking about potential outcomes of a situation. Marianne Williamson said, when we do speak, the key to communication is not what we say, but the attitude that lies behind what we say. And that is so true in these difficult dialogue situations, because so much of the time, conflict happens because not of what we say, but how we say it. Whether it's an apology, whether it's trying to understand someone, whatever it could be, how we say what we say has a lot to do with where the conversation goes next. So I love this Stephen Covey's concept, seek to understand. Seek first to understand and then be understood. It's one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. And he talks about that in his book, of course, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand. That means that before we try to communicate our point of view to the other person, be sure that we are seeking to understand first. Then we can worry about being understood ourselves, but be willing to be that first person to seek to understand them. This will, when we can do this and we can master this skill, this would solve more than 50% of our difficult dialogue situations right away, because so much of the time, a difficult dialogue situation happens because we don't feel understood or the other person doesn't feel understood. And if you can make sure that they know you're seeking to understand, that gives them the emotional space, the emotional air they've been looking for. And they go, oh, okay, somebody understands me. May not agree. We're not saying that you have to agree with the other person, but make sure that you are looking to empathize with them. Now, the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is coming into an agreement with someone else and an agreement with their position. I'm not saying you have to sympathize with them. I'm not saying you have to necessarily automatically agree with their perspective. Empathy is looking to understand their perspective. And it's okay to say that, right? It's okay to say, hey, I want to understand your point of view. I suggest this to so many people who are like, well, how do I have this conversation? Or, I'm not sure about so-and-so, or I don't know if I can trust this person, or I don't know really what happened, or any number of situations that can blow up at home or at work. My first advice is always go to that person and seek to understand them. This happens a lot. This is a great skill to apply a lot at work when you're having difficulty, like with a coworker. And I hear so many people who are like, well, so-and-so and I just don't click, or we don't just get along, or I don't think they like me. And I go, well, they may not feel like you were trying to understand them, or vice versa. So first and foremost, understand. Go to them and seek to understand. You can sit down with them and say, hey, I want to understand your perspective on this issue a little bit better, or I want to understand this situation, or why did we blow up at each other in the meeting, right? Whatever it is, making sure that you're saying, hey, help me understand. I'm not necessarily agreeing. I'm not necessarily sympathizing. I'm just empathizing, looking at it from your perspective. And make sure that you're ready to empathically listen. If you're not ready to listen, you're not ready to talk and have that conversation. And the key thing with empathically listening to someone is maybe rephrasing content or emotions restate it to understand, but don't try to refute it or disagree with it or justify your opinion until that person truly feels understood. And this is a huge skill, but it's one you have to practice. It's one I still have to practice. But empathically listening. So when you say, hey, help me understand why we blew up at each other in the meeting the other day, that person may be like, well, you interrupted me. And you could come back with, you feel like I didn't value your perspective because I interrupted you, right? So that's just me rephrasing their emotion and their feeling. I'm not justifying or I'm not correcting or saying, no, I didn't interrupt you, right? If I jump to, no, I didn't interrupt you, I just immediately shut down the dialogue right there. If I just rephrase that emotion or that feeling of they didn't feel valued or appreciated because I interrupted them, that just lets them continue to talk. And this is such a powerful concept. It is hard to do, but it is very powerful in any high stakes conversation. So look for little ways to practice this. It does get easier. It is a skill. It does take practice for sure. William White said the greatest enemy of communication we find is the illusion of it. And that's, again, a lot of times situations, conflict, or problems are caused because we think communication has actually occurred and the other person still doesn't understand, or we don't understand, right? And that's the illusion. That's what creates a lot of conflict. So learning to communicate effectively, particularly when it is a difficult dialogue situation, is a powerful tool. Now, one way to start these difficult dialogue situations is declaring intent on the front end. Sit down with that other person and compare and contrast or declare intent, or both. An example of this would be, hey, I don't mean to offend you, but, or you could say, hey, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I don't understand why this happened, or I don't understand what this situation is. You can also just go on to say, hey, I did want to check and see, where are we? So, for example, if you had a miscommunication with, let's just say Saturday morning. Let's say you made plans for Saturday morning and your spouse made plans for Saturday morning, and you got to sit down and figure out what went wrong because one of you was not where they were supposed to be on Saturday morning. You can sit down rather than blaming that person, saying, why weren't you on the same page? Why weren't you where I needed you to be on Saturday? You can sit down and go, hey, I don't mean to hurt your feelings here, or I don't mean to offend you. I just want to understand, where did I fall down on the communication about Saturday morning plans? Take the responsibility, take the initiative. Instead of blaming the other person, take the ownership for the situation and go, hey, declare intent. I don't want to offend you. I'm not trying to cast blame here. I just want to understand what I need to do differently next weekend, right? These are principles of communication and connection with someone. And again, says easy and does hard, but it does get easier when you practice and apply them. Charles Blair said, have an understanding so you don't have a misunderstanding, right? And that comes down to being proactive yourself and taking ownership for the situation, if possible, even in advance. Taking ownership for communicating and connecting with the other person so that hopefully you can minimize difficult dialogue situations to begin with, right? And that starts with our self and leading ourself through being proactive, responding to any situation based on the values. This is one I want to touch on because so much of the time when we're in a difficult dialogue situation, we know we should listen, we know we should seek to understand, but learning to ask questions first so that understanding can occur is powerful. And when you ask a question, listen for what's not being said. Listen for what's not being said. And then make sure you understand, right? Again, we kind of come back again and again to making sure that other person feels understood. If it's a difficult dialogue situation, make sure that they are feeling understood before you can move on, before you can rephrase anything. Making sure that they have And that might take more than one question. Honestly, that might take several questions. Ask a question, rephrase the content or the emotion. Ask a follow-up question, rephrase the content. You might have to do this several times. But when that person finally feels understood, then you can reply. Then you can kind of come back to them with trying to share your viewpoint, trying to share your perspective. And again, you could use some of those tools of declaring intent. Hey, I finally understand where you're coming from in this perspective. I don't want to rupture our relationship. Can I share with you my perspective? Can I share with you my understanding? Can I share with you how I see it? So use those conversation skills. Pull those tools out of your tool belt in these high emotions, difficult dialogue situations. I love, I'm a big fan of good quotes. I love Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote here. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in a moment of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Our ability to lead ourselves well through difficult dialogue situations says so much about our character. And these are critical conversation skills all of us should have at home and at work, is being able to lead ourselves well in those situations. And ultimately, we are going to get it wrong sometimes. And when we get it wrong, take ownership for being the first to apologize. Apologize when appropriate. And a couple of things here I probably don't even have to say, but be sincere. Don't apologize if you don't mean it, because the other person is going to be able to feel it if it's not heartfelt apology. And make sure that it is heartfelt. A lot of times we are communicating our sincerity level through our tone of voice and body language. And if it's not heartfelt apology when we've goofed up, when we've made a mistake, then the other person will feel it, right? Of course, actions always speak louder than words. The most heartfelt, sincere apology in the world is not going to help us if we repeat the behavior again. But that's we could do a whole nother podcast on actions speak louder than words. But for now, let's just keep that reminder that sometimes we do need to apologize. Do it quickly, do it sincerely, do it thoroughly. Make sure that you are offering that apology when needed, right? Taking ownership, again, rather than extending blame, taking the ownership for that. So I hope that helps. Those are just some of the conversation skills, the communication skills that I cover in those difficult dialogue chapters in my book, Straight Talk. And I know, it's kind of like everything in life. These are not new principles. You've probably heard a lot of these principles before, but you kind of can't get too much of the good stuff, right? Making sure that we are internalizing these principles and concepts, because the more that we do, the more that we put them in, the easier it is to apply them when we get in those emotional conversations. The deeper that we understand these skills, the easier, and principles, the easier it is to apply them, because you're not thinking your best self when you're in a difficult dialogue situation, when your emotions are high, when there's a lot at stake, when there's a vast difference of opinion. You're not always able to pull out your best critical thinking skills in that moment. So the easier, the more that you apply these concepts and practice them and get them right, the easier it's going to be to pull them out when you need to in a high stakes, critical, difficult dialogue situation. The more that we put them in, the easier it is to pull them out, particularly in times of high stress and high emotion. And ultimately, at the end of the day, remember that life is tough, but God's grace is always enough. We are going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect, but our influence with our other relationships doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from taking ownership and saying, you know what? I'm working on me. I don't have to be sick to get better, because life is tough. But when we make a mistake, God's grace is always enough. Until next time.